What does this single-engine helicopter, this twin-engine helicopter, and this turbine-powered helicopter all have in common? Let's find out on Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. What these three machines, and I've actually thrown in a fourth for good measure, all have in common is they were designed and built by the Sikorsky Aircraft Corporation. Before we get into our story, have you joined our VIP mailing list yet? We have a link in the title block, or you can scan the QR code right there on the screen. Here's what you get: a bi-monthly newsletter, photos and stories that have never been used before, like this F-117 refueling from a KC-10, or Wes Martin Jet Ace. We tell you the stories behind these images. And a sneak peek at next week's newsletter will be the story of how this photo was taken at a major national U.S. airport in the 1960s. But now back to our program. We go back to the very beginning of, no, you know what? That's too far back. Let's try the 20th century. That's better. We go back to the beginning of the operational practical helicopter. In this case, it's the de Beaufort quadricopter, which flew in December of 1922. Pretty cumbersome craft. It did lift off the ground in ground effect. It was tethered, but it never flew in terms of maneuverability, and it was a pretty limited machine, but it was a start. Then there was this machine and this gentleman who we're going to talk about in a moment, and this became the world's, America's, I should say, first practical operational helicopter design. Some other configurations bear mention here. We have Frank Piasecki, who is the father of the twin rotor concept called the Flying Bananas. And this lives on today in the United States Army Chinook helicopter, still in operation. First flew in the 1960s. Charles Kaman had the intermeshing rotor concept, and that evolved into the very successful HH-43 Husky Air Force Rescue helicopter. But we're going to talk about the company behind this logo, and it's this man, Igor Ivanovich Sikorsky, a Russian-American aviation pioneer in both helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. Born in Kiev in 1889, he was the youngest of 5 children. By 1912, he had won awards for his aircraft designs, and he held FAI pilot's license number 64. Sikorsky is credited with designing the world's first aircraft capable of carrying 6 passengers, the revolutionary Ilya Muromets, that flew only 11 years after the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Compare its size and performance with the twin-jet Tu-104. After immigrating to the United States in 1919, Sikorsky founded the Sikorsky Aircraft Corporation in 1923, and by the 1930s had developed the first of Pan American's long-range ocean-crossing flying boats like the S-40 and S-42 Clippers. But his name will always be synonymous with helicopters. In 1939, he designed and flew the Vought Sikorsky VS-300, the first practical American helicopter, which pioneered the single rotor with single anti-torque tail rotor configuration used by most helicopters today. In 1942, the 2-seat R4 took to the air for the United States Army and became the world's first mass-produced helicopter. Here we see the Coast Guard version, the HNS-1, evaluating float operations. A larger tandem 2-seat helicopter developed for the Army, the R5. This became the H5, which was used in the Korean War. And for the Navy, the HO-3S Dragonfly. The Dragonfly was used by aircraft carriers for rescue operations, and this would be the view of a downed airman in the water just about to be picked up on the hoist. What does it say up there by the door? Oh, remove chute. Yeah, weight was critical in this machine. And the civilian version, the S-51, was built here in the U.S. and by Westland in Great Britain. The S-52 was Sikorsky's attempt at a personal helicopter. and it became the first helicopter to ever perform a loop. That took place on May 9th, 1949, at the Sikorsky plant in Stratford, Connecticut, and was flown by company test pilot Harold Thompson. The S-52 never went into production, but the S-51 was a very successful helicopter. And in July 1946, the first new helicopters delivered to a commercial operator were 3 S-51s flown by Helicopter Air Transport, seen here in Camden, New Jersey. LA Airways, an interesting story, and you see there at the lower right in the logo AM 84. That refers to Airmail Route 84. The S-51 seen here landing at a helipad on a golf course in Pasadena, California, became the first airmail service by helicopter in April 1947. But a new helicopter came from Sikorsky, and it was a large passenger-carrying aircraft that was connecting airports in a civilian operation by New York Airways. It was called the S-55 Skybus, a revolutionary concept. And in 1953, it became the first scheduled helicopter passenger service in the world. Here we see an S-55 coming into land at New York's Idlewild Airport, the original terminal building, and that's the temporary tower as the new International Arrivals building in the beginning of Terminal City was happening in the mid-1950s. An interesting side note, if you look at the 4-engine airliner just below the right-hand rotor blade of the S-55, that's a Canadian North Star. On the West Coast, Los Angeles Airways was using S-55s for its passenger operations. And it was a novel concept. They would actually have the helicopter right at the base of the stairs as you got off your United DC-6 mainliner. You'd get on the copter, and it flew all over Southern California. But the big trip was to fly out to Disneyland, which had a heliport adjacent to Tomorrowland. You can see the TWA moon rocket there in the background. What I wouldn't have given for one of these. It was a friction toy. You see it in Sabina markings on the cover of the box, but it's New York Airways in the box. I would have loved that one. And of course, we can't talk about toy helicopters without the Revell kit of the Sikorsky S-55, even though this is the military version in Army colors with Air Force markings. It's actually the H-19. Now let's take a look at this box. Okay, there's the rotor hub and the rotor blades. Something's funny about this. What could it be? Well, you've got the advancing blades at the top and on the left, turning in counterclockwise direction, but the retreating blade on the right is turning the opposite way. We've talked about this before, the little tricks that were played on us by the box top artists to make us look and buy the model. This is the reissue, a stunning Jack Lenwood painting, one of my all-time top favorites, the HO4S, Navy version of the H-19 in Antarctica, and the Marine version. Nice use of cool and warm color. Just the best. The H-34 Choctaw was a larger, more powerful version of the S-55. It was a tailwheel-equipped helicopter. It had a larger cabin. And the Army's practice of naming its helicopters after Native American tribes originated from the 1947 U.S. Army Regulation AR 70-28, which was enacted to honor Native American history. And that proud tradition continues to this day. Here we see an H-34 operated by the Los Angeles County Sheriff. And the civilian version, the S-58, went into passenger operation all around the world. Sabina flew them in 1958 for the Brussels World's Fair. Here we see two Sabina S-58s, one taking off and one about to receive its passengers. Here in the U.S., Chicago Helicopter Airways operated S-58s, and you see the extra windows that were added. And the jet age arrived with Sikorsky, the S-62 single-engine turbine passenger helicopter, and its larger brother, the S-61. There were two versions. The S-61N, which stood for nautical, was actually an amphibious helicopter. And the S-61L for land operations was seen here, flown by LA Airways. That later became Golden West. I got to fly this helicopter from Disneyland to LAX. Would have been an hour-and-a-half drive in traffic, 6.5 minutes by copter. In New York, the S-61s were used in 1964 for the New York World's Fair. They both gave sightseeing flights above the fair in Flushing, New York, and connected the fair to Kennedy Airport at that time. And then S-61s were later used in connecting all the airports and operating off the Pan Am building in Midtown Manhattan. But before that, in the late 50s and 1960s, it was Boeing Vertol and the V-44 at upper left, the Boeing Vertol 107 at lower right were the primary means of transportation around the New York area. But in the 1970s, the S-61 reappeared and passenger service was reestablished for the better part of that decade. Overseas, S-61s were used by many different operators. Here we see British European Airways and British Airways, and they were great for transporting workers to oil rigs offshore, in this case in the North Sea. The CH-37 Mojave first flew in 1953 and was Sikorsky's first twin-engine heavy-lift helicopter developed for the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. It features large forward clamshell doors for rapid boarding and deployment of 26 fully equipped combat troops. A total of 154 Mojaves were built. Now, applying the CH-37's drivetrain and 5-blade rotor system to carrying external loads resulted in the S-60 flying crane, which made its debut in 1959. Only this one prototype was built, however. But it took turbine power to make this concept viable, and the S-64 became successful in both military and commercial operation during the 1960s. Many are still flying today as firefighting water bombers all throughout the world. The H-3 became famous in the retrieval of the Gemini and Apollo astronauts. And the Air Force version, the HH-3 Jolly Green Giant. And that name came from the cartoon character used for a food company. And ho, 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 Valley of the Jolly Green Giant. But these were wonderful machines and saved many, many lives in the war in Southeast Asia. The H-53, Sikorsky's largest helicopter, an amazing machine, the Sea Stallion, and here we see the Marine Sea Dragon with the large external sponsons, which held a lot of fuel, but an amazing helicopter. And this brings us to today's backbone of the military services, the Black Hawk. The H-60, here we see it as the Pavehawk Air Force version, which is special operations and rescue. And these helicopters are refuelable in midair from a KC-130. Here we have the UH-60 Medevac Black Hawk for the U.S. Army, the MH-60 Jayhawk for the U.S. Coast Guard, and this machine, which you can see around Southern California, it's the S-70 Firehawk, and this configuration used by the LA County Fire Department. The S-76 executive helicopter was originally designated as S-74, but that was changed to S-76 in honor of the U.S. bicentennial in 1976. And then there's this machine, seen in the skies above Washington, D.C. It's the Marine One helicopter used to carry the President of the United States. So there you have it, a look at Sikorsky helicopters throughout the years and the wonderful machines created by Igor Sikorsky. As always, special thanks to the wonderful folks who make these presentations possible. And thank you so much for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. Really appreciate you watching the channel. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, take care.